everyone. We are live. My name is Kellyanne. I'm a bookseller at Mysterious Galaxy. I am so excited for tonight's event. Tonight we are joined by Gretchen Felker-Martin to celebrate her new novel, Manhunt, which came out a couple weeks ago. Manhunt is a post-apocalyptic horror that follows trans women and trans men on a journey of survival. We are so excited for tonight. I know I just said that, but me and my fellow bookseller, Rob, who will be helping in the comments section and moderating that. We are huge fans of horror and queer horror in this store. We are also joined by our conversation partner tonight, Lee Mandelo, whose debut, Summer Suns, came out last fall. And Summer Suns is one of my staff picks. So if you guys haven't purchased either of these books, you can do so by clicking that green button that says Buy Books with Signed Book Plates below our video. And if you haven't joined us for one of our Crowdcast events, to the right-hand side, you'll see our chat section. Feel free to write your comments as the event goes on and talk to our authors that way. And last but not least, for the second half of our event, you can ask our authors any question you'd like. You can do so by clicking the Ask a Question button at the very bottom below the video. And remember that you can also upvote questions that you really want answered. So with that, I'm going to turn off my camera and let the event get started, and I'll see you guys at the end.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. All right. So let's get started. Hello. The first part is always the least fun in some ways, but what's our elevator pitch? Just walk us into what you want Manhunt to be for audiences who have not read it yet, though they should have.
What I want Manhunt to be for the people who haven't read it yet is confirmation that someone out there has hurt in the same way you're hurting, and that no human experience of suffering happens in a vacuum. When I was a kid, you could only have this kind of identification with the text obliquely. You would have to put yourself through some sort of metaphorical process. And I want to give people reading this book now a more direct experience. I want them to say, like, I've thought the same fucked up things that these characters are thinking.
Yes, I definitely had a couple of those moments reading it, which was what I wanted and was delightful to me. But I know like a book has won the emotional game of, in a sense, when I'm reading and I'm like, oh my God, and I have to sit with it for a second.
Yeah, that's really what I want. That's like what I want anytime I pick up a book is like, just fuck me up, man.
Yes. So on that, one of the things that I totally enjoyed most was when I heard the central premise, like from day one, I couldn't wait to read it because I felt like you were kind of taking the cultural belief that like testosterone over a certain amount just turns you into this like monster animal who just wants to rape and eat raw meat. And then we're like, okay. And so that was delightful. And what kind of drew you to going that direction? Or how do you think starting from there lets the book do its work?
Well, as I've said elsewhere, a big part of the inspiration for the story was the Screwfly Solution, the Alice Sheldon story about fictional plague or event which drives every man on the planet completely insane, so that they just want to rape and then murder all the women around them. So I was building off of that and kind of exploring the space of all the people in that world who we don't see, who don't exist to the narrative because the narrative is focused on other things that are more sort of immediate to Sheldon's interests. And part of me wanted to take this talking point that I've had thrown at me, that every trans woman has had thrown at her, and that so many trans men have to sort of deal with internally and externally when they consider hormonal transition. I mean, I know so many trans masculine people who, before starting HRT, have come to me like, what if it makes me a worse person? What if I get all angry and can't cry anymore? And it's like, it breaks my heart.
Yeah.
So I wanted to take this really fucked up thing that people have been beating the drum about for years now and just fling it back in their faces and say like, well, fuck you. So what? The world will keep going.
Yeah.
Like, this has nothing to do with individual people. It's a bogeyman that you've conjured.
Yes. And I think, yeah, that was part of what spoke to me so much about it, is that is a thing that I will admit to wrestling with as a much younger man, being like, well, what about it? Like, what will happen? There's all these weird myths about this. And of course, they're all bullshit. And that's sort of the point here. So I also, since it is a horror novel, and one of the things that I think we have vibed on in other places is horror being a very intense feeling genre. Like, you know, you get to put yourself through the extreme shit and know what it will be and work through it. So is that like, what is the space of horror or like the techniques you can pull from it doing for you as an artist? And we can talk about movies here if you want.
Yeah, happily. I mean, you know, I watch a ton of movies. I'm a huge cinephile. I think for me, horror is a space where you can put your fingers in your wounds, and in so doing, discover their depth and nature and whether or not they need to be like fleshed out. It's a way to map where your body and mind are in pain for one reason or another. And I think that I don't believe that there's like a moral imperative to teach people how to behave with fiction, but I do think that horror can provide an opportunity to feel deeper empathy for yourself and for others.
For sure. It was definitely my experience of it also growing up as a big horror nerd. It was maybe the only place where you got to kind of think of your body and your limits and your feelings in those ways.
Yeah, I mean, horror is very sexual in a lot of ways. It's intimately connected to like having an immediate grounded sense of your own body, not in this case because you're trying to figure out how to have an orgasm, but because you have to consider how you could die.
Yes. And hey, sometimes those are gently connected in my fiction.
Yeah, man.
Yeah, I mean, body horror in particular, like some of the most fun, as much as that's like kind of a fucked up way to say it, like parts of the book for me were reading the body horror parts, because like so often, even though I enjoy it as a genre, it's very much about like framing disability or fatness or queerness or all these things as the bad thing you should be scared of happening to you. And that's infuriating. And I loved reading Manhunt that it's doing the opposite. It is sort of looking at all of these things and saying, well, what about the bodily experience of these things? What about the social world and how we treat people with disabilities? Like, what about that? So that was awesome to see. And it kind of let me engage as a reader with body horror in a way where I didn't have to like cover one eye as I did it and be a bit like, okay. So what is that like for you? Like, what draws you to doing it that way? Or as an artist, how'd you handle it?
Thank you so much. I'm really glad that it worked for you. I'm a lifelong body horror fanatic. I got into Alien and Cronenberg's movies very, very young. And they've always been really resonant with me. I think part of that is because I have body dysmorphic disorder. So I experience like obsessive compulsions about real or imagined aspects of my appearance. And sometimes it'll get so intense. It hasn't happened in a while, but it'll get so intense that I'll start hallucinating about my body, and I'll have these like really awful experiences, like becoming convinced that my skin is rotting or that I have like sores somewhere. And obviously this is like completely inextricable from gender dysphoria, because where are you going to draw lines when you're just feeling terrible about the physical artifact of yourself? And I think like I said, kind of putting your whole fist in the wound feels really good sometimes.
Yeah.
Make sense of all those feelings and the toll that they've taken on you and the shape that you are because of those experiences.
For sure. Yeah, I think that was one of the most fascinating parts of thinking through some of the ways that bodies show up in the book for me, was almost reflecting back on like surgery experiences, being like, I thought I would feel super fine about this, and I'm delighted with the experience afterwards of top surgery. But yeah, the just brutal sense of like, oh, what if I'm dying? Like, what if something is rotting and I will not know? Was not what I expected to come from that for the first few weeks. And I did like have those flashbacky sort of moments, because the book is still dealing with like, well, how would you work with this in the post-apocalypse? How would this still happen? And that was very, very good as a reader to work through.
Yeah,
more about bodies, which, you know, the fun question for this one, everybody fucks a lot in Manhunt in ways that are like extremely varied. So also, Cat is so cute. As another, you know, person on team really tired of the moral panic that we are living in as a sex panic and all those things, I really enjoyed how Manhunt dealt with sexuality in a lot of ways. So we had scenes of like coercion and violence, but also like really intense joy and intimacy, or just like being confirmed in yourself because someone wants to fuck you, which is a super real experience. That was one of the many lines where I was like, ah, yes, okay. Working through that one. So how are you thinking about writing bodies and sex in Manhunt? And what are some of the concerns or frustrations you're kind of bringing into the project about it?
I think for me, it's that so often anyone who is sort of perceived as being deviant in any way is immediately desexed. Like there's a large body of work in both scholarship on fatness and fat liberation and on disability justice that is about how functionally being in those bodies is a different gender experience.
Mm-hmm.
That you are classed as kind of a supernumerary gender. And that's something that, like, as a fat trans woman, is really deeply personal to me. It's something that's really personal to almost everyone that I know and love. And there was just no part of me that was going to get a chance to write this book and get it out to a big audience and not fill it with all kinds of weird sex. Like, I feel like I'm not doing my job if I'm not affirming the people who feel bad and scaring the people who feel good.
Yes. Yeah, I remember the particular scene that I'm thinking of describing like the pleasure of being sexually with someone with a fat body was so awesome. Just like that is a long, sexy, emotionally intimate scene that is, I just cannot remember the last time I saw that in a book. And that's like fucked up in its own way, but it's wonderful that it was in this book and that we saw it that way. So thank you.
That's like very important to me to have like interesting, complicated fat characters and to relay the experience of finding something other than like shame or moral failure in the fat body as an image.
Yes. And you very much did. And it was wonderful.
Thank you. Thanks.
Yeah. Kind of on that note also, in terms of like, what are we doing in the book with all these characters that I really, really liked. And so when I was writing the review essay about Manhunt, like one of the first lines that I wrote in it was that I just truly could not give a shit how a cis audience perceived the book, because it was one of the first times in a while I think I've read a novel that was just for and about a trans audience, like both self-critically, but also really, really, really empathetically. There's a lot of care there. And for me, that kind of felt like almost a rejection of the idea of representation, like the flat image, and more about just being present. Like, this is how we exist. So does that vibe for you? Does that have any echoes with how you were thinking about it?
Yeah, absolutely it does. I'm really glad that it comes off that way. It's very much how I intended it. To me, people talk so often about queer community as this sort of nebulous arbitrating force, arbitrating. And I don't think that's actually a thing. I don't think there's any monolithic queer community. I think the queer community is the queer people in your life who you love and support and are connected to emotionally, financially, like all these different things. It's like any community. You're not talking about people who happen to share an identity marker. You're talking about people who are involved with each other, who know each other. And I really, really wanted to live that principle that I hold in the way I wrote this book. I wanted the book to be about the experience of being in community. And for a cis person to come to this book, I imagine is alienating in certain ways because it's written for trans people. And, you know, I'm grateful to all my cis readers. I'm sure they're just as smart and interesting as my trans readers. But it's not for them. And if they don't really get it, that's fine. I wasn't trying to make them.
Yeah.
This book is for us because I love us.
Yes. And I think, like, I wish it wasn't such a beautiful, shocking thing to be like, oh, this is a book for us. But I really felt that very deeply and emotionally while I was reading it, because it doesn't seem to have any interest in like walking people into an explanation of what these references are and what these quotes, the intro sections of the book, like sections, the pieces that you chose were so intense and a lot in the best possible way. Like opening section 2 with the Janice Raymond quote. It's like, woof. And
yeah,
like people, yeah.
Whenever we talk about trans rights and like the modern struggle over what you'll hear referred to as the trans question, which is a pretty fucking telling thing to call it. So often it's sort of bogged down in these tiny little distraction issues like bathrooms and sports. And those things are a bellwether for the wider climate and a sign of worse things to come, as we've seen. But underneath all of this is extermination.
Yep.
The unspoken thread connecting all of these pieces of legislation is that trans people are not to exist.
Yeah, and I think
that's what Janice Raymond believed, and it's what she still believes, as far as I know.
God, every time I remember that she's still alive, it's a whole emotion for me.
The fact that Janice Raymond outlived Sophie is like just the most cosmically unfair thing I can imagine.
Truly. There's something about evil that seems to really live on in a particular way.
Her and Henry Kissinger, man.
Right.
Clinging to life.
Well, now that I've gotten us here into my fist at Henry Kissinger, which is a reasonable thing to be doing at any point, I wanted to draw us back a little bit to our wonderful trans characters in the book, because one of the things that I thought was so powerful about Beth and Fran both is them individually and also their relationship, because they're going through these very intense struggles around class politics and also passing and the possibility even of assimilation being something that could be handed to you and what you do with it if it is. And I don't know how often I've ever seen that dealt with in a novel in these ways. So how was wrestling with that for you in writing it? How did you approach that, you know, personally, artistically?
Well, it was sort of me hacking my way through those issues myself on the page. These are big societal forces that we haven't really learned how to analyze yet. You'll hear endless sort of social media discourse about passing privilege and whatnot. And I think pretty much everything written in that vein is kind of bunk and mistakes, like issues of class for issues of appearance. And I think really that conflict between Beth and Fran is really an expression of their class backgrounds, because Beth does not come from money. You know, if Beth had had $10 million before the plague hit, she could have had all the surgery she wanted, and I'm sure would have had a much better chance of passing, whether or not it was seamless or whatever. So they have this like fundamentally different outlook on the world. Beth has never been given anything and has never like been lucky or rewarded. So she doesn't expect anything from the world. And sometimes this is kind of a survival skill that lets her get through bad situations. And sometimes it's like, well, now you're going to struggle to see like even the things that are any good to you in your life immediately around you. Whereas Fran is used to getting more or less what she wants. And that's not like to say that that's a bad trait or an evil trait. It's just that it's tremendously different. And I think that until we have this kind of class-based understanding of the trans experience, the picture is incomplete, and it's not one-to-one, but it's the same with racial analysis of trans issues. Like, so often when trans people come up, the unspoken part is white. The image of trans people in America is overwhelmingly white.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's something. So I just finished tweeting a whole bunch about reading Sarah Schulman's book on the political history of ACT UP. And so much of her attention is about class politics in the same way of like, you approach the world differently. And I think there was a line in Manhunt that I think Beth says that is about like the nature of middle-classness being such that you can believe the world is fundamentally good and nice things will happen. And that feels very true. Like, to me, as someone from a poverty background also, who's in an academic space again, where middle-classness is the norm, or everyone is trying to pretend to be middle class, even if it isn't. And that's, I think, very visible amongst, even the very small trans community in an academic space for like whose experiences look like what. And it's very class differentiated in those ways.
I can imagine.
Mm-hmm. A source of much frustration among friends, some of whom may be watching. Shout out in that case.
Yeah, I can empathize, even with people you love and who fundamentally like you're on the same side, you're on the same team. That kind of cognitive dissonance between mindsets is so difficult as someone who grew up without money and who went through like a protracted period of desperate poverty. It's so weird to interact with people in any way who have never had these experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the bits in the bunker in particular, a very sharp class analysis that I enjoyed for some measure of the word enjoy on that, Yeah. All right. So also thinking like about material experience, and that was a lot of what I wanted to think about when I was writing about the book, was how much you're focusing on that real lived experience. And like, what does it mean to have a material body and to have a material class experience in these ways? And I read that awesome interview you did with Drew Gregory over at Autostraddle, where I think y'all were talking very compassionately about how important it can be in a trans space and conversation to like hold space for people who aren't sure of their identities yet, for folks like non-binary people who aren't engaging with medical transition in any particular ways, while also still emphasizing like how much we need to acknowledge really radical differences in how our bodies move through the world. And I think that example in the interview is like Ruby Rose, who is a perfectly wonderful ACT person, etc., but like is having a different experience of the world than someone who is going through a medical transition in any way, or who looks differently than what society expects in certain ways and threatens that a little bit more. And yeah, how do you want to talk a little about how that comes across in the novel, or just how you're thinking about it at the moment?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think a lot of, especially online discussions of transness as a thing that can have degrees or whatever, a lot of that is very much rooted in the interior sense of self. And that's a real thing.
Yeah.
You can't really challenge someone's sense of self. How could you? What grounds would you have? But the sense of self is not inherently a meaningful experience. You may feel non-binary in some way, but if you are not violating society's norms, that might not be very important in a material sense. And it's okay to recognize that, and it's okay to have that experience. I think a lot of people really beat themselves up over, like, am I queer enough? Am I trans enough? And I guess, like, if I had one thing to say to them, it would be like, well, who's judging? Like, there's no committee. You can just use that word for yourself and, like, work on getting confident about it. Because I promise the only reason anyone is going to get annoyed with you is if you never shut up about it.
Yes.
And I do think that there is some learning for people like that, people who do not have, like, a visible exterior experience of those identities, that there's a need to not foist the work of developing confidence onto people who do have those experiences, people who do face society's rage and violence. You know, we're not here to validate you, but if you're cool and make friends with us, then you're one of us.
Yeah. Yeah. I think,
again, it comes back to, like, community in a real sense.
Yeah. And that can be so difficult in an online space in particular, where I think so much is literally about the visible and the surface, because that's all you have in an online space. Whereas when you are in your living bodies together in queer space, making community, you see the differences in yourselves and how you experience the world. And that's something that has come up a lot for me recently in the, you know, the back channel of your living queer community conversations of frustration in that sense, especially with bills about medical restrictions and their potential. I think everyone is scared of losing our hormones. If you are on them, that is a concern. If you are not, it isn't. And that's a material reality in that sense. So yeah, I think that's really important to have that compassion about, but also to really deal with how it in some ways feels like an instantiation of white fragility, even though we have our conversations about whether white fragility is a useful term, etc. And that sense of insecurity and not moving past almost a sense of guilt, in a sense, that you are not experiencing these things, but people you care about might be. And is that, like, making you insecure, rather than thinking of it in the same way as, like, well, if I'm a white person in community with a lot of people of color in my queer community, sometimes I'm going to have to own that my experience of my queerness is different as a relative factor of that. And that's actually just fine.
It is. It is. I feel like there's such an obsession with being sort of morally seamless, with knowing all the right things to say and all the right words to append to your Twitter bio so that you won't be hurting anyone. And the truth is that as a white person, you do not have the option to not hurt people. Your very presence will be painful to people. And your job is not to fix that, but to own it and, like, listen to people who are in pain.
Yeah.
Listen to people who have a generational deficit because of the things we've taken from them. And then make good materially.
Yeah, exactly. The practice of community building. It's very complicated. And I do think that really comes across in the book in a lot of ways. Like, as much as it's difficult in many ways on purpose in an enjoyable way, I think it's very hopeful. Like, that was kind of where I got at the end, which I don't know how many people who started in the first section would be like, this is going to be a hopeful book by the end. But I think that hope really came through in how you did deal with what does it look like to build community and to have these intra-community critiques and conversations, and that it's always work. Like no one is having an easy, simple time of it. And some of these things are really irresolvable. Like Beth and Fran's experiences of the world around them cannot be placed in such an order that no one is being hurt ever. And I loved that. And I kind of wanted to ask you how you were feeling about the ending without spoiling it, but like what community building contributes to surviving the apocalypse, maybe.
As far as I'm concerned, that's what we have. That's it. It doesn't matter if it's what we want. It doesn't matter if it's the thing that is most likely to help us survive. It's what we have. A lot of people nurture the dream of assimilation. I think most or all of them know in their hearts that it can never be achieved. The dream in my heart is of a world for people like us. And I think that we can have that.
Yeah. Sorry, I had my moment of emotion there also. Yeah, I think particularly one of the most, like, the for us thing to sit with for me in some aspects in the middle of the novel is how queer community can also particularly fail trans women and trans femme people, more broadly speaking. And I think that that's something that I have witnessed a lot of, and will do just a delightful little shout out to a lot of trans masc folks who have not unpacked some of their internalized feelings about femininity and misogyny and tend to take that out in some very particular ways on trans women. And I thought that was really important, how upsetting those scenes were to read. And I just wondered how you felt about writing them. Like, what was that like for you as an artist?
It was really hard and really personal. No one died in my experiences of these things, but they're based on my experiences. The sequence that happens at the Flying Saucer Collective when Beth and her trans feminine friends get thrown out at the start of the pandemic in a flashback, that's based on a woman that I know who got kicked out of her house for making a little cis woman feel uncomfortable by raising her voice. There is this fixation on personal comfort and a very sort of like white tears version of, and let me acknowledge, I know that it's not one-to-one. There's no comparing trans and cis dynamics to the dynamics between Black and white people. But I think it's a useful metaphor. As a culture, we're so trained to respond to a woman's expressions of discomfort and fear with violence for the person who's seen to have inspired it. Women need to be protected, especially small, normatively beautiful women. And women deploy this both cynically and reflexively in order to hurt people that they would like to reaffirm their hierarchical relationship with. And I've had this experience, and virtually every trans woman I know has had this experience. And unfortunately, I think that some trans masculine people cling to this idea of their own sort of essential nature as a victim, and cling to this weaponization of victimhood. And my life is full of brave, interesting, intelligent trans men and trans masks who I just could not make it through the world without, and who mean the world to me. And I don't even think that it's the majority of trans masc people who act out in this way. But it is a really, really troubling trend. And I wanted to be honest toward those experiences that have happened in my own life and in the lives of trans women around me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that is something that I have witnessed also, like just to confirm, hashtag confirm out there on that very frequently. And I think that there is something about it. There's a line in Hill Malatino's little trans care book about how it's almost preferable sometimes to hear rhetoric from people who are open about hating you than it is from people who claim to be kind of on your team, but you can see in those see-through little moments what they really think of you. And that what they really think of you is that you are not X, Y, or Z thing. And that it comes through in those moments of stress that they don't really think that way. And I think that that is very real and very painful, and something that I'm glad, even if that's not quite the word, is in the book, because I think it's something that needs to be talked about more often. And I think building our communities, like this is my trans masc cap here. I think if you're a trans masc person who has no trans femme friends, you should ask yourself why that's the case. And do the work before you go try to pick up any friends and make their day very bad.
Yeah, there's so much love and beauty possible in the connection between trans women and trans men, and that makes it very painful to see it curdle.
Yeah. To
see people fighting over nothing in a gutter that they're all stuck in regardless.
Right.
It gets very tiring to realize that the end result of any desperate situation is that everyone decides to stomp on trans women.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Oh,
sorry.
Oh, no. I didn't really have anything to say.
Yeah, I was just gonna, again, support that as an entire statement and say that particularly as an effeminate gay trans man, some of the best and most supportive and understanding relationships that I have had with people that are willing to really talk about gender and what is all of this that is happening in a way that doesn't feel horrible are trans women and trans femme people who have other experiences of their relationship to femininity that I think are beautiful and useful for everyone to listen to. To have to really love your femininity is great. And I think it's good socially.
Too.
We got very heavy on a lot of those questions.
Should we maybe switch over to, I think we've got some audience questions now.
Yes, we can do the Q&A now. All right, let me pull up as the moderator. All right, we have an upvoted one, so we can start there. The question is, there's so much rich and vivid medical detail in Manhunt. What kind of research did you do for the virus and beyond?
Oh my God, I read so many medical textbooks. I never want to look at another one in my life. Learning how to do even just how to describe in broad terms harvesting eggs from a human person was so tedious and so exhausting, and having to puzzle out every step of the process of artificial insemination and selection of fertilized embryos for given traits. Just tremendously irritating work. And not work. I mean, it's interesting to me on an intellectual level, but the actual process of learning and internalizing and then conveying all these minutia in a way that isn't completely overwhelming and alienating to the reader, it's a real pain in the ass. I'm glad that it came off as so rich. That's really great to hear. It was just it was easily the most work that I did on anything for the book.
Yeah. I definitely also, after reading, looked up some of is this how? Oh, just out of a sort of curiosity about all the medical aspects. All right, another question. 3 votes on this one. The cover of the book is fantastic. Did you have any input in choosing it?
I did have some input. I was involved in creating the broad idea of the cover, but ultimately it was the creative team at Tor that really put it together. And then once we got Sarah Sitkin, the sculptor who did the actual physical sculpture, of which the book cover is like an edited photo, it really started to click. I'm so glad people love it. I've had so many conversations with people who have testicles who are just invariably like, it makes me wince. And I was really hoping that that's what it would do. I was just tremendously happy with every part of the process there.
This is just a me add-on. Did you get a print of it or anything?
I don't have a print of it. I would love one though. My good friend Sarah actually sent me like an old onion skin print of diagrams of halved plums.
Nice.
That was very cute.
Very much so. Okay. Another question. We are such big fans of Tor Nightfire and are so excited about Manhunt. Can you talk about what the querying process was like for you?
So I actually didn't query for Manhunt. I had originally released the first chapter free to read on my Patreon, where I do like film criticism and horror fiction and stuff. And because it had a piece of art that I'd commissioned from Tom Horseman, who's my longtime illustrator collaborator for all my self-published work and one of my favorite artists, it got a little traction. And of course, it's kind of an inflammatory premise. So that also propelled it along, and it got in front of Connor Goldsmith, who reached out and asked if I had representation, and wound up signing me as a client. And he handled the whole submission process. It's really unfair, but I had actually stopped querying for years before this, just because it wasn't really something I was interested in anymore. I was having a perfectly lovely time just sort of putting out my gross little historical horror books and puttering on my way. But Connor was a gem, and I would strongly recommend to people that if you're looking to attract representation, have work out there. Like, post things publicly. Don't let yourself be held back by embarrassment or whatever. You never know who's watching.
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely, especially if you enjoy doing criticism and things. That's a great way to do it. And you get to talk about the things that you like or hate. Let's see. Ooh, another research question. What's your favorite fact from the research that did not make it into the novel?
Oh, that's easy. If you store it in a glass container and keep it underground in a cool, dark environment, preferably dry, maple syrup can last for hundreds of years, perfectly edible.
Huh.
Yeah.
Where was that going to come in?
Well, I was looking up the shelf lives of various foods and what could be preserved over any given period of time, and like when the last batches of edible canned food in America would go bad. And I just stumbled across it. And I thought that was really amazing. The right conditions, you could just keep it forever.
That's pretty phenomenal. I would not have thought that syrup was the secret there.
Right? You could pop the little wax container off the top and have it on your pancakes in like 2300.
That's delightful. Right. Who? This is a good one. So if Manhunt were adapted as a movie or series, do you have a dream cast for any of the characters?
I do. I would love to see Anna Taylor-Joy as Sophie. The big, freaky mantis eyes would really do it, I think. And either Molly Parker or Parker Posey, one of the two Parkers, for Teach, who I think has to be either a weird little reptile woman or someone like very teacherly and authoritative and affected. So much of the cast basically has to be unknowns because there are no actors who look like that. And that would be super exciting to me if a studio was willing to take that risk. We have had a little bit of movie interest, so fingers crossed that something comes of that. This is very kind of basic of me, and I know that everyone loves to bag on Euphoria, but I love Euphoria, and I love Hunter Schafer on Euphoria, and I would love to see her as Fran.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah, I do find it fascinating how people loved Euphoria season 1 quite openly and now suddenly have decided they don't. It's like a whole social moment, and I'm not sure what's going on there entirely.
My personal opinion as a one-time television critic is that it's more of the sort of consensus disease that we saw around the end of Game of Thrones when everyone heard one opinion and then decided that was the opinion.
Just watch the thing.
Right. You're not, what are you doing, man?
Yes. All right, we've got 2 more in the audience questions. Good time. So the bowstring chapter had me on the edge of my seat the whole time. What was your favorite action or tense scene to write?
My favorite actually was the bowstring chapter. It's in the beginning, so the book is sort of more decompressed. There's more time for these small granular things. And that, I think, was probably the most fun I had with research, was learning how a compound bow worked and how you would restring it and how normally you would need like a whole press to keep it from inverting and snapping your neck or breaking your arm, because there's so much tension contained in the shaft. And it just lends itself really well to the kind of nail biter vibe that you get in like late season Breaking Bad when they're trying some ridiculous, incredibly tenuous heist, which is, I was revisiting scenes from that show pretty regularly to kind of figure out how to build and release tension, which is very difficult, but extremely rewarding to get right. And from what I've seen, people seem to really, really like that scene. So I feel pretty good about it.
Yeah, I will third that one because as someone who is many times in life as a Kentuckian shot a compound bow, was like, how are they doing this together in this scene safely? Like there was a lot of bonus tension because I was also thinking about the like, you can die. Like
yeah, it's tremendously unsafe.
Yeah, it's just extremely unsafe. Yeah, I think maybe everyone. I assume then very much success because you got all the tension. We're all remembering that.
I'm so glad. I'm action and suspense have not been my forte, and I had to do a lot of work on that. So, yeah.
When you're thinking a lot about vibes, sometimes action is different.
Yep. I'm a very vibes first writer.
Mm-hmm. Relatable.
Yeah.
Okay, our last audience question was also one of my last fun questions. So excellent. What are we both currently reading? And I will also say watching if we want to do both.
Oh yeah. I just finished a reread of Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall, Bring Up the Bodies, and The Mirror and the Light, which are on any given day, there's a pretty good chance that I would tell you they're my favorite modern novels. They're like pushing the format of the novel in a way that has a lot in common with what James Joyce is doing in Ulysses. It's more accessible, obviously, but it's very much this sort of stream of consciousness, polyglot tangle of mastery over a double handful of subjects. And the literary feat of taking Thomas Cromwell, this guy who is like the Mitch McConnell of his time, and turning him into this incredibly complex, fascinating, compelling character is just unbelievable to me.
Yeah, the level of prose skill that is involved there is a lot. And I have also read Wolf Hall, as you can see, and I think it is almost transparent for a reader who's not like attuned to looking at prose. Like you can simply read it, like if you want to do that. But if you're looking at the prose, it's so intense. Like, how did you do that?
Yeah, the density is unbelievable.
Yeah. Watching any TVs or film stuff recently?
I've been watching a bunch of samurai movies just to sort of fill in the blanks of my cinematic education. I just watched Shogun Assassin today, which is an adaptation of Lone Wolf and Cub, the famous serialized tale of this disgraced executioner and his son who wander the countryside as traveling samurai. I'm a big fan of samurai movies. I love 13 Assassins, 7 Samurai, anything with like a number and a bunch of guys. That's extremely good. Big fan of the Sword of Doom.
There's also like a different narrative structure sometimes, I think, that's very pleasurable to engage with when you've seen a lot of the same kind of structured like Western television in a lot of cases for a while. My shout out is to Beyond Evil, which I watched when it first got subbed on Netflix and now has like gotten a bunch of people watching it. It's Gomul in Korean originally, and wow, it is playing with genre in a way that I have not seen in a very long time. You think it's one show, the first few episodes, it becomes a very different one, and then the second watch, even that first half, is very different when you know what happened with everyone. And it also ends up being about community and trauma and how the police aren't very good at their jobs, even though it's about police, which I don't see very often.
That's such a cool through line in Korean art, is that they're all like, yeah, police are fucking idiots.
Yeah.
Morons, useless. I gotta check that out. That sounds great.
Yeah. Intergenerational bonding also.
I've also been watching Station 11, which like is incredibly brutally close to home to like watch this story about the world after plague. But it's something really special. It is a beautiful, heartbreaking show.
Another good friend of mine, literally yesterday, who may be watching even right now, had begun watching it and was like, "You will love this. It is everything." So now that's a confirmation. All right. I think we did all of our questions. Oh, the final wrap up, as always. What's next, if anything? I know the worst time to ask it's when a book has just come out.
Right. The traditional author torture.
Yeah.
So I'm actually putting the finishing touches on the first draft of The Cuckoo, my next book, which is about a group of queer teens who in the mid-90s are shipped off to a conversion therapy camp in Utah. And they slowly begin to realize that something at the camp is replacing their fellow campers with copies.
Oh, God.
And the copies are cis and straight and well-behaved, and the copies go home to the parents.
Oof.
And then I don't have anything officially planned for after that, but I am working up a little outline for a story called Baba about the worst winter on record in Worcester, Massachusetts. And it's this story about like intergenerational relationships between trans women and the parasitic relationship between cis women and trans women.
I cannot wait for both of those. Well, this has been super fun.
Thank you so much for doing this with me. I'm just like, I've been looking forward to it all week. This was really great.
Yes, and I loved the book, as probably came across to the
Thank
audience.
you so much. I'm also, just for reference for the fans, I'm a huge, huge fan of Lee's Summer Sons, which is like a really muscular, sort of matter-of-fact, academic, gothic ghost story novel that is just like, oh my God, it's like a cold beer on a hot day. It's so fucking satisfying.
Perfect description.
Well, thank you guys so much for being here tonight, especially being on the East Coast. We really appreciate you guys joining us for this virtual event. And we had such a great time. The conversation was fantastic. Thank you so much to our audience for joining us and all of your questions. If you guys haven't, you can purchase Gretchen's book, which will come with a signed book plate by pressing that green Buy Books button below. And thank you guys. We'll see you at the next one. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me.